I've been fact-checking Steve Hodel for 20 years, since Black Dahlia Avenger, which is this one, came out in 2003. And I will tell you, Steve Hodel lies. He lies all the time. He lies about everything. But I thought it would be useful to look at how does he lie? What are his methods of lying, and how does he get away with it? Okay, so let's try to be scientific about it and categorize them. Okay, Steve Hodel has 4 techniques for lying. Okay, and they are inflation, distortion, suppression, and fiction. 4 shuns. So what are the 4 techniques? First of all, inflation. Okay, inflation starts with a kernel of reality and progresses to something that's way overblown. Okay, that would be great example. Simple example of that is George Hodel's IQ score. Steve likes to say, my dad had an IQ of 181, 1 point higher than Einstein, and that, here comes the joke, it skips a generation, ha 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 ha. Okay, that's his line on it. Okay, that's inflation. How is it inflation? Because his dad's IQ score is really 151. Okay, how can I be so sure? How can I say that with such authority? We'll get into that. Okay, distortion. Now, closely related to distortion is distortion is close to inflation because, again, it starts with a kernel of reality, but it's not a linear progression like the IQ. Distortion is where Steve starts with a kernel of reality and then goes off in a bizarre direction. And that would be, my dad killed his secretary or was suspected of killing his secretary. And Steve attributes that, Boxy, he'll say it's in here. Sorry, Boxy, it's not in there. I have the files, it ain't there. Okay. And the third method, suppression. This is where Steve gets sneaky. He will tell you part of the story, but he leaves out the important parts. Great example of that is a very familiar story. Policewoman Myrl McBride was quoted in the paper. She had an encounter with Elizabeth Short in a bar on Main Street, and Elizabeth Short said, "I'm waiting for my daddy." And of course, that's fine. Steve wants to establish that there is no missing week. Okay. Anyway, what Steve will not tell you, and in fact, no one will tell you that, is that Patrolwoman McBride made the identification of Elizabeth Short based on a verbal description. Okay. This was the description of Elizabeth Short that was verbal. When somebody showed Policewoman McBride the famous iconic mugshot of Elizabeth Short, she went, "Oh, well, I don't know." He doesn't tell you that. Nobody tells you that. It's like she walked it back. And that's suppression. And the last one is fiction. What's fiction? That's where Steve just makes something up. Totally. Great example of that is his alleged father's photographs of Elizabeth Short. Okay, no, those aren't pictures of Elizabeth Short. That is all just fiction from the get-go. George Hodel was part of the Lewis Terman study. Lewis Terman was the guy at Stanford. He put Stanford in Stanford Binet. Okay, that's Lewis Terman. George Hodel was a participant in Lewis Terman's tests. The test results are online, and people who want to download them can. They are hard to find. I had help. I get a lot of people who help me on little bits of that. Thank you, all the people who helped me. But the results are online. Now, they were transferred from computer punch cards, so they're a little hard to interpret, but and the results are anonymized. And so what you have is somebody in the Lewis Terman study who has George Hodel's date of birth. Okay, male. Okay, male, George Hodel's date of birth, born in Southern California. Okay, and lived outside the country in later years. Okay, what's the IQ? 151. So we can be reasonably sure. And I only say that because that is a good example of how Steve inflates this. Okay, the next one is distortion. And this is a common one. I wanted to talk about this anyway, because Steve will tell you, Boxy, it's in here, the death of Ruth Spaulding, his secretary. Okay, again, it starts with a kernel of truth. George Hodel had a secretary. The secretary was named Ruth Spaulding. She died in 1945. That much of it, that's true. That really happened. Okay, that happened. Anything beyond that, no. He will say it's in here, poor Boxy, that his dad was suspected of killing the secretary or killed the secretary because she knew too much. A lot of people in Steve Hodel's parallel universe know too much, and Ruth Spaulding was supposedly one of them. Now, in reality, which is where we live, we can get Ruth Spaulding's death certificate. It's online. I have it. I've posted it online, in fact. Ruth Spaulding committed suicide. She took an overdose of barbiturates. And what Steve Hodel will say, and he gets a pass from everybody who interviews him, he'll say, oh, well, my dad overdosed her or forced her to commit suicide. And it's like, okay. I'm sure there's some cat owners here. Have you ever tried to give a pill to a cat? So the reality is, how do you kill yourself with barbiturates? Well, you have to take a lot of them. It isn't just one or two in orange juice. You need to take either a bottle or the most of a bottle with alcohol. Alcohol is part of it. And when you do your research on that's how it was done. Ruth Spaulding's death was investigated by the coroner's office. As all suspicious deaths are, it was ruled a suicide, and that is that. Suppression, again, that is when Steve doesn't give you the complete story, like Patrolwoman McBride, and he does that a lot. That's just a good example of it. And then finally, fiction, the photographs of Elizabeth Short. They're not her. They were never her. And Steve will say, well, I found the photographs. And then we'll say, well, it's not her. And in fact, one of the women saw the picture on TV and said, hey, that's not me. That's me. That's not Elizabeth Short. And so he did announce that one of the women identified herself. Okay. Elizabeth Short's family went on the record saying, which they never do. Elizabeth Short's family never goes on the record about anything. They said those pictures aren't her. And so what Steve will do is he will go all the way around. He'll say, well, the pictures are her. Then he'll say, if he's jammed, to say, well, it doesn't matter if the pictures are her or not. They just serve to get me interested in the case. Okay. And then he'll come around and say, well, I've got German facial recognition software that to 85% or whatever it is, identifies these photographs as Elizabeth Short. And then he'll say, well, Elizabeth Short's sisters, her family, they were really old. They forgot what she looked like. They were only talking about this one picture. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So he goes all the way around, but he is desperate for those pictures to be Elizabeth Short. They're not. They never were. They never, ever will be. And so that is fiction. And that is the four methods, Steve Hodel's 4 methods. Now, the question is, how does he get away with it? How does Steve Hodel get away with these lies? And the answer is ignorance. Ignorance is Steve Hodel's greatest tool. He absolutely knows people have no idea how law enforcement works. People have no idea about the history of the LAPD. People have no idea how police work goes. People have no idea about the court system. People have no idea about, unless you've been on a jury, you haven't a clue how the jury system works, and it's not like on television. People don't know how grand juries work at all. Boxy, we're talking about you again. People don't know that grand jury proceedings are always in secret. Testimony is always secret. It's not a big deal. That's how grand juries work. He knows that people don't know about the medical profession. People don't know anything about modern art, and so he can bamboozle them, and that's how he gets away. And I've listened to so many interviews with him where people just give him a pass.